Nothing will crush a real estate investor's spirit like landlord stress. The difference between being successful and miserable in managing properties is education. Welcome to Landlord University, where landlords learn. Landlord University is recorded from inside the RentPrep office, where Stephen White and Jeff Pearson share the lessons learned from working with some of the most successful landlords.
Welcome to Landlord University. I'm Jeff Pearson. I'm here with my co-host, Stephen White. Hello, Stephen. How are you doing today?
Pretty good, Jeff. So I'm especially excited today for this episode because we have with us Dani, who is a regular contributor to the RentPrep blog. And if you follow the RentPrep blog, I'm sure you've read her articles. They're usually geared towards legal issues. And the reason is because Dani has a lot of experience as a former defense attorney and has extensive experience with insurance and employment law. And she also teaches writing at Western Michigan University. So she's very well versed, very well spoken. And we love having her on as a contributor to the blog. And took a long time to coordinate this podcast and have the three of us get on here. So it's exciting to have her on finally. So welcome, Dani.
Thank you.
And so, Dani, give us a little bit of background on your experience and some of the experience that you draw from when you write for the blog and where you come up with a lot of your ideas.
Well, my experience in legal practice is all in civil litigation defense. So clients who are being sued for various reasons. A great many of them were insurance companies. I did work with a few employers, and I've worked with a few landlords who have dealt with tenants who felt aggrieved enough to actually involve the courts in their problems. And
Yeah. All right, and so, I think a lot of times when you're writing, you're also what makes your writing so great is that you're sharing some of that experience, but then you're also giving really good actionable advice for landlords. And the one sort of continuous piece of advice that you're always giving, and we're always hitting on it here on the podcast, is the importance of documenting and documentation. So I'm sure you've seen your share of cases that maybe didn't go the way that somebody would have expected because they had a lack of documentation. And I'm sure you've seen it go the other way, where the documentation, was a key part of them winning the lawsuit. And had they not had it, they probably wouldn't have been able to come out on the other side of it. So, just sort of from your experience, do you see that landlords typically do a good job with this, or is this an area that they really need to work harder at?
honestly, I think anybody who works in the rental business, and really anybody who runs a business where they're exposed to any kind of lawsuits, can benefit from better documentation, more meticulous documentation. I love clients who come in with all of their paperwork and they can tell me, I know that there is no foundation for this lawsuit because I have it here, here, and here. And it's fantastic. If I could give really one piece of advice to just about everyone who is concerned about their lawsuit exposure, it would be to document everything.
Mm-hmm.
Because you never know which piece of information a judge is going to look at and go, that's it. I'm absolutely convinced this is how it happened.
One of the things that we talk about a lot on the podcast is when we talk about documentation, that doesn't mean you have to get out a pen and a piece of paper and write everything down. In this day and age of technology, Google Documents is your friend because you can accomplish all of this online, whether you're doing it on your phone or on your computer. You can put it into those documents and you have it. You can email it to yourself and have it in multiple locations. You can print it. There are a ton of things you can do just by using Google Documents or something similar to that.
Yeah, or even taking pictures, snapping photos on a cell phone to show damages. I'm sure that's also, great when somebody walks in and has, picture documentation as well to help support their case.
Yeah. Now, Dani, on some of the notes that you had shared with us about some of the stuff we were going to talk about, you pretty much said, the number one questions most landlords have for their lawyers is, how do I avoid getting sued? And why don't you tell us a little bit about that? And that's going to take us right into talking about the documentation.
Sure. Number one question a lot of clients ask is, how do I avoid getting sued? The bad news is you can't stop a tenant from filing a lawsuit. America has a very open court system, which means that anybody who can walk in, file the paperwork, and pay the fee can file a lawsuit. So the important question to ask is, how can I avoid losing a lawsuit if one is filed? And documentation is the key to protecting yourself and maximizing your chances of succeeding in any lawsuit you might face.
Now, Dani, in addition to the documentation, do you have any advice for landlords with structuring their business in an LLC versus, having everything in their personal name? Does that help them or hurt them in any way? I know that a lot of landlords look to the LLC to limit their liabilities, but does that make a big difference when it really comes down to it?
It can. The LLC can be helpful in some ways. It does limit liability so that a landlord's personal possessions and personal assets aren't on the line when they're sued.
Mm-hmm.
The principal downside I find to LLCs is the extra tax paperwork, but certainly help is available for that.
Right. So overall, you would say in the industry, you would recommend looking at the LLC route if you can handle the additional tax. And I agree with you on that too. That the additional tax is really the only downside to it. But LLCs these days are relatively simple to set up, quick and easy, and usually it's the right thing to do, especially if you're managing multiple units and really have a lot of liability out there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the things that landlords need to document, not only documenting when there's a problem, but I think it's also important to point out that documentation should be continuous. You don't want to just grab the notepad or jump on Google Docs whenever you have a problem. You want to be documenting right along always, right?
Right.
So that way when a problem does arise, you're well prepared, obviously, and you're not scrambling then at that point to try and remember or refresh the story and trying to piece the puzzle pieces together. You've already got it laid out basically, and you're just continuing to add to that documentation. So what are some other things that landlords might need to keep in mind when they're thinking documentation?
Well, it's important to balance between keeping efficient records that you can find quickly and that catch the important stuff, and documenting everything, because you can become overwhelmed by paperwork, obviously. So of the top things I would recommend that every landlord document consistently, the first one would be the money. Keep a ledger sheet for every tenant, record every exchange of money, the date, the amount, the type of payment, what the payment was for, whether it was rent, whether it was repairs. When you refund a security deposit, write that down. The money is just so important because most tenant disputes are about money in some way. When tenants go to court, it's because they want to deal with the money.
Right. And we've covered a topic here on the show before where a landlord refunded a security deposit in cash, never wrote a receipt, and the tenant successfully sued that landlord for not refunding the security deposit because he had no documentation of it other than saying, well, I gave the guy cash. So that's a clear example of, that need for continuous documentation in every case where money's involved. I agree with you completely on that. Okay. So what are some of the other things?
Money is important. Also, and you mentioned this briefly, document the condition of the rental unit before you let the tenant in for each rental. Take photos, make notes. If you have a list of things you need to repair, that can be helpful for you as well as helpful in future litigation. I know in some states, I practice in Michigan, which is one state that requires you to give the tenant an inventory form for the tenant to go fill out problems on the property. If your state requires this, or if you use these, keep a copy. If your tenant never returns it, make a note of that.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is very, very difficult for a tenant to argue, well, that problem was there when I moved in, when they were expected to write it down and tell you and they never did.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point, and you're right. Each state sort of handles this differently, and I think that most um, landlords who are handling things correctly use some sort of a move in, move out sort of a checklist. Now, in Michigan, is there a specific like state form, or is it just basically say you have to have something in place that covers sort of the move in, move out, and inventory type of a thing?
It's a standardized form. It's very thorough. I have never had a landlord who didn't use the standard form, and I'm not entirely sure what would happen if you didn't. But I also don't think our form's required by law. I just think everybody uses it because it's so thorough.
Gotcha.
It would be hard to duplicate a better, more thorough form.
Right. Well, that's a great point to make up there is, or to pull out there is, to make sure that in your state, if they make forms available, look for that. Do you happen to know in Michigan where that form would be available? Is it available like on the state website or something?
I imagine it is. Michigan's pretty thorough about putting things online. Most landlords I've known, you can actually order them and they come with 2 or 3 carbon copies, which is very helpful because the tenant can fill out one form and you can give the tenant a copy, you can keep a copy, have an extra. It's very useful that way.
Gotcha. Now, in your experience, have you ever, I'm curious for this, just for the sake of the business that I'm in, have you ever ran into any litigation surrounding the issue of background checks or applications?
Not in the landlord-tenant sphere. I have done a little bit with background checks and discrimination in the employment sphere, and there's some overlap. I mean, in both cases, you do have to be conscientious of the information you're allowed to collect and the information you're allowed to consider when you're evaluating a tenant. And this is another place where documentation can be really helpful. Because when you keep copies of applications and you keep copies of background checks, you can show the court directly, this is what I looked at.
Yeah, and another thing I again, I think is important to point out, especially for landlords who might deny an applicant. It's a question that we get a lot of times here at RentPrep is how long should they hang on to those applications? And we always tell them a good safe number is 5 years, because you may deny somebody and so they're technically not a tenant, but that person may later on down the line feel that they were discriminated against. And so you want to have that documentation, even of, anybody that you're dealing with, not just tenants and not just the people that you're renting to, but also in some cases, especially those that you're denying, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. The worst thing in the world is to have someone you don't remember come back 6 months or a year later, and you have to dig and you have to rack your brains and try to remember. Yeah. So being able to lay your hands on the paperwork is so helpful.
Right. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this next question or not, but I'll ask it because I think a lot of landlords have this impression that the state that they're in, and it doesn't matter what state it is, but the state that they're in is not friendly to landlords. And I think in some cases maybe they're right, but can you say confidently one way or another? Do you think that the laws are geared to put the landlord at a disadvantage? And maybe if you could only speak from the state of Michigan where you have experience in, but do you feel that sort of general feeling that landlords have is right, or do you think that there's no basis to it?
I think certainly some states are more landlord friendly than others. I would say that Michigan is probably slightly more friendly to landlords than tenants, although like every state, our court decisions tend to sort of swing from one extreme to the other. So we'll go through phases where judges are feeling very tenant friendly, and then they'll sort of swing back and start pulling back and, adhering to the letter of the law a little more closely. And then they'll start trying to extend out again. And a lot of areas of law do this. There's kind of a long-term swing between poles. In Michigan especially, most tenants actually have more rights than they realize that they have, which sometimes works in a landlord's favor and sometimes doesn't, because you'll get cases where tenants will not only know what rights they have, but will insist they have rights they don't. And while that's not necessarily a legal problem because they're not likely to win, it does require your time and effort and concentration when you have so many more important things to deal with. Mm-hmm. So I think informed tenants can be actually helpful for landlords in a lot of cases.
Right. Now, in the one case where it's not helpful for the landlords is when you're dealing with what we would call a professional tenant. So these are tenants that are sort of out there taking advantage of landlords. And I think in a lot of cases, sort of provocatively trying to find ways to sue landlords and trying to create problems and messes and things like that. So have you ever dealt with anybody that you would consider to be a professional tenant? Or is there any way for a landlord to sort of protect themselves against them? Or is there any way to look up even in the state of Michigan and say, okay, this is somebody who has a long history of suing landlords, and as a landlord you'd want to obviously be cautious of that?
Yeah, I've had the good fortune not to have had to defend against a professional tenant. Many of them seem to almost make a game out of knowing the law back to front, not just landlord-tenant law, but also procedure. Mm-hmm. And they can be very, very meticulous about what they file when, just to keep you in court, which is so frustrating, from the lawyer's perspective, when we really do want to handle most of our cases as efficiently as possible. Mm-hmm. Honestly, documentation, like with any tenant, documentation is very helpful against the professional tenants. And as for sort of looking up the major bad apples, my first stop is often Google. I will often Google professional tenant and then maybe the name of the city or of the state, because as they do this over and over, landlords talk and they share information, and many of these people wind up in the news. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's too late by the time it occurs to you to look this up, but even knowing what they've done before can help you know what to expect. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here. This is going to be a tough question to answer probably, but maybe Jeff, I can get your opinion on this. You mentioned something that really sort of stuck out to me, and it sort of reverberates what I hear a lot of times from landlords as well. When you mentioned, the tenants that understand the law and the procedure, I've dealt a lot of times with landlords who are screening an attorney and will tell me, I don't feel comfortable renting to this attorney because they almost feel the attorney is at the advantage and knows things that they, and almost trying to catch them up on things, whether they are or not. I think it's a pretty common fear for a landlord to say, great, now, I've got to deal with this person who clearly has a more, a deeper knowledge than I do of the law. And, it really puts you on high alert. So, and Jeff, maybe I can get your opinion on this.
Sure.
Would you feel comfortable renting to an attorney, knowing sort of in the back of your mind? And I think, in the cases where I've talked to landlords, I feel like maybe there was some sort of a flag that was thrown that the landlord was on alert or worried about it. So I don't think that just in general, you should not rent to attorneys, but I think it's somewhat of a pretty reasonable fear, right?
Well, I think if you're running your landlord business as a business, you don't have anything to fear because you're doing everything above boards. You're documenting. I mean, we talk about documentation all the time, and Dani, that was the big thing that we have her here to talk about today. If you're documenting everything, if you're taking care of your property well and properly, I don't think you have anything to fear because as Dani said, anybody can take you to court at any time for any reason. And a lawyer knows better than most that it's a waste of their time and a waste of your time to just go to court for the sake of going to court. The personality aspect that you kind of hinted at there, that's a different beast. If you've got a lawyer who just in the way that they talk with you and deal with you, just like somebody who's not a lawyer, you get that vibe from them as to whether or not this is somebody that you want to have to deal with on a professional basis. And to me, it doesn't matter if it's a lawyer or not a lawyer. As long as you're running your business like a business and you're documenting everything, you're taking care of the property, I don't think it's a problem.
Dani, any thoughts on that?
I think Jeff makes a very good point. Definitely sort of listen to your intuition, no matter who you're renting to, lawyers or non-lawyers. One small measure of comfort, perhaps, for landlords who are considering renting to an attorney is that attorneys, not only do we have a sense when we may be wasting everyone's time and money, we're also bound by professional ethical obligations to avoid bringing patently frivolous lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
And the standard for patently frivolous, of course, varies a little bit by state, but you're not likely to get an attorney who sues for utterly unfounded reasons in the same way that you might get a layperson, a non-attorney tenant who would try that.
Right.
So there is that as well.
Now, and great point. And you also brought something else up that I wanted to ask about, which was the costs involved. Now, from a landlord's perspective, having to pay for the attorney to represent you against, let's say, a tenant lawsuit, is that something that would be covered by their insurance, or is there any insurance policies that would help them cover the costs of a lawsuit?
I believe so. Certainly, there are insurance policies that cover just about every kind of alleged business malpractice. And I imagine there has to be a policy available for landlords that would cover that. Mm-hmm. Often there's a deductible, which, of course, is something you negotiate in the process of deciding what policy you want and what you want to pay in premiums. But yeah, I mean, when I did insurance defense, the vast majority of our cases came through insurance companies who were insuring various professionals against lawsuits.
So also obviously important to make sure as a landlord that you've got the right insurance coverage. You want to make sure you've got a landlord policy versus just a traditional homeowner's policy that's probably not going to cover anything in terms of cost. But if you've got a specific landlord policy, those usually do, cover you against anything that could possibly come up with having to deal with tenants. So that's going to be, a matter of what policy you have as well.
Right. A homeowner's policy is going to protect you against claims that are based on your alleged failures as a homeowner, like your alleged failures to keep your house in decent condition or to control your dog or, not bother your neighbors in various ways. Mm-hmm. Whereas a business malpractice policy is going to cover what you are doing in your business as a landlord. And those are two different things usually.
Right.
So, Steve, I'd like to go back and finish. We were talking a little bit about what to document. Dani had mentioned some of the things, like money, keeping a ledger sheet, the condition of the rental, doing your walkthroughs. But there are a couple of other things I'd like to have her touch on before we get to the last topic about documentation. So, Dani, record of repairs was one of the topics that you had indicated.
Yes. I think the number one dispute tenants bring is about rent payments. Close behind that are disputes about habitability, about whether a rental unit is fit to occupy. And so when you record every conversation you have with a tenant about needed repairs, the date and time that you perform the repairs, who actually goes, if you have a property manager, who goes to do repairs, write down who it is, write down what they do, any materials you have to buy, keep receipts, write down which materials were used in which place, and keep track of results. Like if you send someone to fix a broken faucet, make sure that they check the faucet works before they leave. And the more you can keep track of these things, the more you can establish that you were aware of needed repairs or weren't aware if tenants never tell you, and that you did everything you could to respond to them in a timely fashion and respond effectively.
So would you make a requirement of your tenants that anytime they inform you of a needed repair, that they also inform you in writing?
I think that can be very helpful. And you can even expand writing to include things like email, because of course you can always print out an email. And usually when you print them out, they have right there in the header the date and time and the address it was from. So that's a very easy way to keep track of date and time as well as information in the email.
Right. And one of my responses to something like that would be, you can't be so strict about that if somebody tells you they have a problem, you have to say, I can't do anything until you send that to me in writing. You can ask them, hey, I want to keep for my records a copy of this in writing. I'm going to start working on it right away, but please send me something. But you can also follow up from the other side. You can make that response an email. You can put it in writing and say, hey, I got your phone call about the broken and I'm going to be having somebody take care of that right away. But if you get a chance, could you just send me something in writing? And that to me would be a way of making sure that you have all of those records, so that if you do have to go to court on habitability, you can say, well, they gave me all of these different repair items and these were my responses, and this is how they were taken care of, when they were taken care of, who took care of them, and the materials that we used to fix them.
I think that's a very good idea. You can always get started on something, and and if you get a phone call, you can also jot yourself a note and put it in the file.
Okay.
So it's called on this day about this.
Okay. So in addition to records of repairs, copies of all correspondence between you and your tenant.
Yes. And I think this is a natural extension of getting things like repair requests in writing, is to keep copies of them. If you email with your tenant, print out the email, put it in the file. When your tenant calls, jot yourself a note, day, time, briefly what you talked about, put that in the file. Some people like to keep these in chronological order. It's not necessary for lawsuit purposes, but it can be handy if you need to find something quickly.
Right. And you talk about printing things out and putting it in a file. I'll go back to my technology world. You can print to a PDF file and upload that to your Google Drive. And you can put those in folders. You can have a folder for every property. You can have within each property, you can have a folder for repairs and finances, and you can separate that out however you want. But it's pretty easy in most situations to get everything you have into that Google Drive so that you don't have to worry about where it is. You have access to it anytime, anywhere, and it's organized the way you want it to be. And you can certainly take all of those and also print them out on paper and put them in a paper file. The more copies you have and the more ways you can access that tends to be the better situation.
Yes. Lawyers, we tend to be behind the curve technologically, so I don't think about Google Docs, but certainly a PDF is every bit as useful to you as a paper copy. Yes.
Great. So the last thing you have on here, and it's pretty straightforward, applications and background checks. It just makes sense to have files for all of those things. So I want to move right into consistency. You talked in the notes about being consistent and keeping things up to date. Talk a little bit about that.
Documentation is your friend. Consistent documentation is an even better friend. Often I have won cases, not only because we had the documentation, but because it was consistent. And when your documentation is consistent, when you write down every single rent check, for instance, that you receive from a tenant, suddenly when there's a gap, when there's a month where you didn't write a rent check, that becomes very significant. Because it shows the court that you were on top of this and that your records can be trusted. And so the gaps in your records can also be trusted. I think often tenants will attempt a lawsuit because they believe in the old saying that you can't prove a negative. They may be thinking to themselves, I'm going to win if I claim I sent that rent check because the landlord can't prove I didn't. That's a negative and you can't prove a negative. Well, if you have a year and a half of nice, consistent records showing that you received this rent check every month, and then 1 month you didn't, that's as close as you're ever going to get to proving the negative.
Right.
Because the more you can show that when you are paid, you write it down, then it starts to become very clear that if you didn't write it down, you must not have been paid.
That makes sense. And I think the breadth of consistency makes sense as well. Not just that you write down every time you get a rent check, but if you do write down every conversation you have and all of your repair things, if you have a wide variety of documentation, I would think that goes towards being more valuable.
It does. The more consistency you can demonstrate, the more you're supporting your own case for the particular pieces of documentation you want the court to focus on, like a missing rent check or like a repair that you did carry out.
Right. And again, going back to the Google Docs argument, if you create a spreadsheet that you use for recording the transactions, your rent checks and whatnot, every time you make that record, there's an electronic record of when you made that. And so you could go back to the history and say, every month, within the first week of the month, I made this entry. And it's not as if you tried to recreate those documents. It's there in black and white when you did that.
Right. And that's actually a very wonderful feature of electronic documentation, is date and timestamps.
Mm-hmm.
And Dani, I think just to kind of bring us along here, and one of the biggest or most popular articles that you had ever written for RentPrep was talking about questions that you would ask your new landlord-tenant attorney, or how to find a good landlord-tenant attorney. And, I think the overall concept of that article was even just the importance of having one. And I'm a firm believer that, you need to have a relationship as a landlord with an attorney, so that if something comes up or if a problem arises, you have that established relationship and you're not scrambling trying to find somebody. So having that in place ahead of time is certainly important. But can you give us any advice as an attorney about, maybe some of the things that the landlords should be looking for or asking when they're trying to find, who is going to be their legal representation?
First of all, definitely look for someone who has experience representing landlords. And that's not always easy to find, especially in a lot of smaller cities. Landlord-tenant law tends to get overlooked in legal practices from both sides, actually. But you can ask around, ask other landlords who they trust, ask other landlords who they don't trust. Often, often you'll also get good advice from people. People are happy to talk about why they don't like someone, I realized. It sounded terrible. But definitely ask around for recommendations. And then when you start, speaking to attorneys and explaining that you're in the business of renting properties and that you're looking to sort of build a relationship with an attorney, a lot of it, again, is going back to sort of that intuition about this person as you converse with them. If this attorney feels like someone you're going to be comfortable calling or sending an email and saying, hey, I think I have a problem, probably that attorney is a better choice than one that is sort of off-putting to you.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely find someone you're reasonably comfortable conversing with.
So you kind of want to use that same talent you use when you're using your gut to choose a tenant. You want to use that same talent to choose an attorney. In addition to the facts, Steve, you've talked about it like 2/3, right?
Yeah. You mean 2 parts facts, 1 part gut feeling on that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think you're right. No, I've got quite a bit of experience working with attorneys, and, a big part of it is really finding out what they specialize in. And, as a landlord, you want to make sure that they've got, a lot of experience in evictions or dealing with these type of things, because you don't want to have an attorney that they're learning this for the first time, and you're their guinea pig, by any means. So you want to make sure that, they have their practice is specialized to fit your needs and what you're looking for.
Dani, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with listeners today?
I don't think I can stress enough how useful documentation is, not only in resolving a case in your favor, but resolving it quickly. I've handled so many cases where, with proper documentation, I can file a motion to dismiss, or I can file a motion for summary judgment, and we get the thing resolved in the landlord's favor without ever having to prepare for trial or go to trial and put in the extraordinary amount of work a trial represents. Good documentation allows you often to simply write up a brief saying to the court, it cannot have happened the way my tenant is saying. For these reasons, here's the paperwork to prove it. And especially when your tenant really has nothing but their say-so, that's a very powerful thing to hand to a judge.
Right. And that's really important, not just if it goes to court, but I'm sure there are some situations where you're dealing with somebody who's a bit more reasonable, where you can present that evidence to them and keep it from ever getting to the point that it actually goes to trial. Maybe they've filed a lawsuit and you can go to them and say, look, I've got all of this documentation that shows that you're wrong. And I'm sure that there are times that you can head it off before it ever even gets to that point.
And I think the importance of that documentation also is sort of a checks and balance system for landlords too. I think by reviewing your documents, it may be easy to really spot some things that you need to be more consistent with, or handle better, or handle faster. If you're doing a good job documenting and you start to notice that a month ago a tenant brought something up about a repair and you still haven't addressed it, or you haven't addressed it appropriately, I think that that's a good way to sort of keep landlords on the right path, and continuing to do the right thing, because there's plenty of landlords out there that don't do the right thing. I know that for most of the interview we assumed that we're dealing with landlords who are doing the right thing, but there's certainly those out there that aren't. And I think that the documentation can also reveal sort of our own practices as well, and help you find some holes and inconsistencies. So just all around, not only for your own protection but for your own business, make sure that you're running a good business. I think that helps with that as well.
Yeah, if you're not documenting well and properly, you're not running a good business, and you're setting yourself up for failure as a business, let alone exposing yourself to losing lawsuits, not just being sued, but losing the lawsuits.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, Dani, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And this is really good information for people to take and really put to use. And it's the type of information that they can use to help make their businesses as landlords better. And we really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and anyone who wants to read more of Dani's articles, you can find her at rentprep.com. You can just do a search simply for her name, which is Dani, Dani Alexis, Alexis. Like I said, she's a regular contributor. She's got tons of great articles and just really great information on our blog, and we really appreciate not only the time you spent with us today, Dani, but the contribution that you've made to RentPrep. And I know that we get a lot of interaction from landlords. So if you have any questions specifically and you want to reach out, you can find Dani over at rentprep.com, and certainly reach out if you have anything specific. We'll always hold that opportunity to bring you back sometime as well, Dani.
All right.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Landlord University, and remember to visit rentprep.com/landlordu to see show notes and access free resources like forms and guides. And be sure to check out Jeff Pearson hosting his own hit podcast at the